Have you ever noticed how strange prayer can feel sometimes? You sit down, maybe late at night, maybe early in the morning before the house wakes up, and you begin speaking words into a room that does not answer back audibly. No voice, no visible movement, no immediate sign that anything changed. And yet, somehow, deep inside the human heart, there remains this stubborn hope that someone is listening. That hope has survived wars, prisons, deserts, broken homes, hospital rooms, lonely bedrooms, and centuries of suffering. Human beings keep praying because somewhere deep down, the soul still believes heaven has ears. This week's lesson is called Prayer Warriors. But before we talk about warriors, we need to talk about weakness. Because most real prayer does not begin in strength. It begins when a person finally reaches the end of pretending they are strong enough to carry life alone. That is where many of the greatest prayers in Scripture actually started. Not with confidence, not with polished religious language, but with desperation, with tears, with fear, with confusion, sometimes even with silence. And maybe that is encouraging, because many people today feel exactly like that right now. Psalm 116 verses 1 and 2 says, "I love the Lord because he has heard my voice and my supplications. Because he has inclined his ear to me, therefore I will call upon him as long as I live." Notice something carefully here. The psalmist does not say, "I love the Lord because life became easy." He says, "I love the Lord because he heard me." That changes everything. Prayer was not merely a religious exercise to him. It became personal, real, intimate. He discovered that heaven was not empty after all. God was listening closely enough to incline his ear toward a fragile human voice. There is something deeply moving about that image. The creator of galaxies, leaning in toward one person praying quietly in weakness. The God who holds oceans in place, paying attention to somebody whispering through tears at midnight. Scripture repeatedly paints God this way. Not distant, not cold, not irritated by human need. Present, listening, near. Sometimes, people imagine prayer as humans desperately trying to reach an unreachable God. But the Bible tells a different story entirely. Again and again, it shows a God already moving toward people before they even fully understand how to move toward him themselves. That is what makes Daniel's story so powerful. Most people remember Daniel because of the lion's den. But long before the lions came, there was already a secret strength shaping his life privately. Prayer, daily, consistent, hidden prayer. Daniel was taken from Jerusalem as a teenager when Babylon conquered the city around 605 BC. Imagine the trauma of that moment. His home destroyed. His future uncertain. His identity threatened. Everything familiar suddenly gone. Babylon did not merely conquer nations physically. It tried to reshape people spiritually, change their names, change their thinking, change their loyalties. Change who they believed themselves to be completely. And yet Daniel carried something Babylon could not erase. A relationship with God that existed deeper than circumstances. That is important because many people only pray seriously when life feels stable enough. But Daniel learned to pray in exile, in uncertainty, in pressure, in a foreign culture that constantly pushed against his faith. Prayer became the place where his identity stayed rooted while everything else around him changed. Maybe that is why some of the deepest spiritual growth happens during uncomfortable seasons. Difficulty strips away illusions of control. It forces people to discover whether God is truly enough when familiar security disappears completely. Daniel chapter 2 reveals this beautifully. King Nebuchadnezzar has a disturbing dream, but he cannot remember what the dream was. He demands that the wise men of Babylon not only interpret the dream, but first tell him what he dreamed. Impossible. When they fail, the king orders all the wise men executed. Suddenly, Daniel's life hangs in danger alongside everyone else's. And what does Daniel do first? He prays, but even more beautifully, he asks his friends to pray with him. There is humility in that moment. Daniel understood something many modern believers forget. Spiritual strength is not independence. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can say is, "I need help praying through this." Scripture says Daniel asked them to seek mercies from the God of heaven. Mercies, not demands, not entitlement. Daniel approached God as someone dependent on grace. That posture matters. Prayer is not informing God about something He does not know already. Prayer is surrendering ourselves before the one who sees what we cannot see. And during that night, God revealed the dream and its interpretation to Daniel. But here is the part many people miss. Daniel's first response was not celebration. It was worship. Before he ever went back to the king, he stopped and praised God privately. Daniel said, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are His." Listen carefully to those words. Daniel's peace did not come from understanding the future perfectly. His peace came from knowing the one who already held the future securely. That changes how fear works inside the human heart. Anxiety grows whenever people believe everything depends entirely on their own understanding. But prayer reminds the soul that God already sees beyond the confusion humans are trapped inside temporarily. The future may still feel unclear to us, but it has never been unclear to Him even once. Years later, Daniel's prayer life faced another test. By now, he was an old man serving under King Darius. Political leaders became jealous of him and searched desperately for corruption in his life. They found none. Imagine that. After decades inside political power, no dishonesty, no hidden scandal, no compromise strong enough to destroy his integrity. Eventually, they realized the only way to trap Daniel was through his relationship with God. So they manipulated the king into signing a decree forbidding prayer to anyone except the king himself for 30 days. Punishment: death in a lion's den. Now listen carefully to Daniel chapter 6, verse 10. When Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home and prayed, as was his custom since early days. That phrase matters deeply. As was his custom, Daniel did not suddenly become spiritual because danger appeared. Prayer was already woven into the structure of his life long before the crisis arrived. And honestly, that is where real spiritual strength comes from. Not occasional emotional moments. Consistency. Quiet faithfulness. Hidden habits formed daily over years nobody else sees. There's another detail hidden inside that verse. Daniel prayed facing Jerusalem. Why? Jerusalem was still damaged. The temple had been destroyed years earlier. Yet Daniel continued praying toward the place connected with God's promises. That means Daniel was not praying according to visible reality alone. He was praying according to covenant hope. Even while living in exile, he believed God's promises still stood unshaken. That kind of faith changes a person internally. It allows someone to carry peace inside uncertainty because they trust God's faithfulness more than temporary circumstances surrounding them. And perhaps that is the real beginning of becoming a prayer warrior. Not dramatic words, not spiritual performance, but daily returning toward God even when life feels uncertain, even when answers seem delayed, even when heaven feels silent temporarily. Prayer warriors are not people who never struggle. They are people who keep turning toward God through the struggle repeatedly until trust becomes stronger than fear, little by little over time. Daniel understood something deeply important. Empires rise and fall. Cultures change. Human strength weakens. But the God who listens remains constant forever. That is why Daniel kept praying when laws threatened him. That is why he kept kneeling when fear surrounded him. And maybe that is why his story still speaks so powerfully thousands of years later. Because deep down, every anxious human heart is searching for the same thing Daniel already found. A God who still listens faithfully, even inside exile, uncertainty, pressure, and fear. There is a moment in almost every serious prayer life when a person quietly wonders something they are afraid to say out loud. Is anyone actually listening? Not because they stopped believing in God completely, but because silence can feel heavy after enough unanswered prayers. Days pass, then weeks, then months, and eventually prayer can begin feeling less like a conversation and more like talking into an empty ceiling. Some people keep praying anyway because they were taught to. Others slowly stop without even realizing it. The words become shorter. The honesty disappears. And eventually, many believers continue attending church while secretly carrying a disconnected spiritual life internally that nobody else can see. That is why the story of Hannah matters so deeply. Because Hannah did not approach God with polished religious language. She came shattered. 1 Samuel chapter 1 says she was in bitterness of soul. That phrase matters. She was not mildly discouraged. She was carrying years of disappointment, humiliation, unanswered longing, and emotional exhaustion. Every year she traveled to worship, and every year the pain followed her there. Peninnah provoked her constantly because Hannah could not have children. In that culture, barrenness carried shame publicly. And over time, shame changes the way a person speaks, thinks, and even prays. Some people listening understand that feeling completely. They know what it feels like to carry pain for so long that even worship becomes difficult emotionally. And then Scripture gives one of the most honest prayer scenes in the entire Bible. Hannah stands before God, weeping deeply. Her lips move, but no sound comes out. Eli the priest sees her and assumes she is drunk because her prayer looks emotionally messy. But she answers him with words that reveal everything happening inside her heart. I have poured out my soul before the Lord. Not presented, not organized, poured out. That is different. Many people still think prayer must sound impressive to be spiritual. But some of the deepest prayers in Scripture sound more like emotional collapse than polished sermons. Hannah teaches something powerful here. God is not frightened by human emotion. He is not intimidated by tears, confusion, trembling, or exhaustion. Real prayer often begins exactly where performance finally ends. And notice something else carefully. Hannah's circumstances did not immediately change while she prayed. Samuel was not instantly born. The years of pain did not suddenly disappear in that exact moment. But 1 Samuel 1:18 says something quietly beautiful. Her face was no longer sad. That line appears before the miracle arrives, which means something shifted internally before anything changed externally. That happens throughout Scripture, repeatedly. Sometimes God changes circumstances quickly. Sometimes He changes the person carrying the circumstances first. Hannah walked into prayer crushed under unbearable emotional weight. She walked away, still waiting for an answer, yet carrying peace differently than before. That is one of the hidden miracles of prayer people often miss. Prayer does not only prepare answers. Prayer prepares heart. There is another scene in Scripture that reveals this beautifully from a completely different angle. Jacob wrestling beside the river at night. Genesis 32 says Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Think about how strange that scene is. This is not calm devotional prayer beside candlelight. This is struggle, tension, desperation. Jacob is terrified because Esau is coming, and Jacob remembers exactly what he deserves after years of deception and manipulation. Fear has finally caught up with him, and during the darkest part of the night, Jacob wrestles with God Himself. The text becomes deeply symbolic because prayer sometimes feels exactly like that emotionally, wrestling between fear and faith, between surrender and control, between who we were and who God is trying to make us become. Then comes the line that changes everything. I will not let you go unless you bless me. That is not casual prayer anymore. That is desperate dependence. And strangely, God allows the struggle to continue until Jacob is permanently changed by it. His hip is touched. He walks differently afterward. His name changes from Jacob to Israel, which means the encounter left a mark on him physically and spiritually forever. Many people want prayer to remove struggle immediately, but sometimes prayer transforms people through the struggle instead. Jacob entered the night terrified and manipulative. He left limping, humbled, and changed. The blessing was not only external protection from Esau, the greater miracle was the transformation happening inside Jacob himself. Prayer changed who he was becoming internally. This is where many modern Christians misunderstand spiritual growth completely. They think strong faith means never struggling emotionally. But throughout the Bible, some of the deepest encounters with God happen during weakness, confusion, exhaustion, and fear. Elijah experienced this after Mount Carmel. Fire fell from heaven. Prophets of Baal were defeated. It should have been the greatest spiritual victory of his life. Yet only one chapter later, Elijah collapses emotionally under a tree and asks God to let him die. That scene shocks many people because they expect spiritual victories to remove emotional struggles permanently. But human beings do not work that way. Even faithful people become exhausted sometimes. Even prophets become overwhelmed. Even strong believers experience moments where their strength disappears completely. And what does God do with Elijah? He does not shame him. He does not lecture him about having more faith. 1 Kings 19 says God lets Elijah rest first, then feeds him, then allows him to sleep again. That matters deeply because sometimes exhausted people need rest before they need explanation. Modern life trains people to constantly push harder, stay productive, keep moving, keep performing. But God often ministers differently than humans expect. Sometimes healing begins quietly through rest, silence, nourishment, and presence. Elijah expected thunder, fire, and earthquakes because that is how power had appeared earlier. But God finally speaks through a still small voice instead. And many anxious or exhausted people miss God entirely because they are only looking for dramatic moments while God is speaking gently underneath the noise already surrounding their lives. One of the most dangerous spiritual lies people believe is this: I need to fix myself before I can come honestly before God. But Scripture teaches the exact opposite repeatedly. The broken came first. The healing followed later. David did not hide his fear before writing the Psalms. Jeremiah did not hide grief. Job did not hide confusion. Even Jesus in Gethsemane prayed with such agony that Luke says his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. That image destroys shallow ideas about prayer completely. The Son of God himself prayed honestly through anguish, which means real prayer is not pretending to feel peaceful when internally you are collapsing emotionally. Real prayer is bringing the collapse directly into God's presence instead of hiding it behind religious performance. And honestly, many people are exhausted from pretending spiritually, pretending they are fine, pretending they are strong, pretending they understand everything God is doing. Pretending faith means never questioning anything internally. But Psalm 62 says, "Pour out your heart before Him." Again, that language appears, pour out. Scripture repeatedly invites honesty before God because relationship cannot survive without honesty. Imagine trying to build a friendship where one person hides every real emotion constantly. Eventually, the relationship becomes artificial. Yet many people approach God exactly that way. They bring edited versions of themselves into prayer instead of their real selves. But God already sees the hidden fear anyway. He sees the anxiety underneath the smile. He sees the exhaustion underneath the routine. And still, He invites people closer instead of pushing them away. That changes prayer completely once someone understands it deeply. Prayer stops becoming a performance for approval and starts becoming a place of relationship instead. A place where exhausted people can finally stop carrying everything alone internally. A place where fear can be spoken honestly instead of silently repeated endlessly inside the mind. A place where human weakness finally meets divine patience face to face. And often, that is where healing quietly begins. Not always instantly, not always dramatically, but slowly, deeply, consistently, like sunrise appearing little by little over a dark horizon. Because God is rarely absent during human weakness. Most of the time, He is standing closest during the moments people feel weakest emotionally and spiritually.